My name is Margaret Peggy Coleman, and I live here in Manchester and am the director of the Russian American Cultural Center at Russia Wharf in Boston. However, the center is currently located in Manchester. And as the director of the Russian American Cultural Center for the past 20 years, I have been researching the ties between Manchester, Salem, Beverly, and Gloucester, and Russia Wharf in Boston, between these ports, and St. Petersburg, Russia. I found wonderful documents like this. This is a manifest of sundry merchandise imported in the ship Sebastian from Russia by the two Cabot brothers of Beverly, and it came from St. Petersburg, Russia to Beverly, November 29, 1784. So after signing the peace treaty with England, American merchants, sea captains, were allowed to go directly to Russia, and this Beverly ship was one of the first ones to go to Russia. So what did they bring back from Russia? They brought back all raw material. Hemp for the rig. Russian hemp was used for the rigging of our ships. Russian iron was used for the anchors and the nails. Russian duck, it's not the kind that goes quack quack, but it's the canvas, was used for the sails of our ships. We imported from Russia raven's duck, linens, candles, tallow, soap, and on even fairly, and on other documents or other ships' manifests, it includes goose quills. So this is a ship called the Tsarina that actually there's a watercolor of it over at the Peabody Essex Museum, but I found the manifest that goes along with it, and it went into Boston from Kronstadt, which Kronstadt was actually the port in St. Petersburg where the ships would anchor, and then the people would be brought up to the English embankment in St. Petersburg. And this manifest includes the quills. It includes more than what was first brought over for Beverly, but it includes the cordage, the oakum, the glue, the indigo, and then 3,746,000 goose quills. Remember, the Constitution was built between two revolutions with England, the Revolution of 1776 and the War of 1812. So the Constitution was built in 1796. So who's our enemy as a result of these revolutions? It's England that's our enemy. It's Russia that's our trading partner. So going beyond even the maritime trade, we've discovered that the Russian ambassador lived here in Manchester in 1905. So for this event, we've created a Russian treasure hunt, hoping that people will look at the questions and think about whether they know the answer to these questions. And I'll give you a couple of examples of them if you could answer. So who was the Russian ambassador living in Manchester in 1905, and where was he living? So if you went to the newspaper Manchester Cricket in 1905, you would see that it was Baron von Rosen, and he was living on the Coolidge estate here in Manchester, where the community had many diplomatic embassies at that time. The Russian one was only one of, I think, 18 different embassies. And another question is, which American president had a daughter who was born, died, and is buried in Russia? Through this more recent research, I discovered that John Quincy Adams was our first minister to Russia, and he had a daughter. He went there in 1809 from Boston, and he took his young son, Charles Francis Adams, with him. He was only 2 years old at the time, And while he and John Quincy Adams and Louisa Catherine Adams were living in St. Petersburg, Russia, they had a daughter born in 1811, and she died after only 13 months in 1812. This work that I do involves books, and I'm a great book person, and I found this one called America, Russia, Hemp, and Napoleon. American Trade with Russia and the Baltic from 1783 to 1812. And I thought, oh, wow, that's just my period of research. And I was looking through the book and came across a reference to this daughter, Louisa Catherine Adams, and John Quincy Adams was describing how terribly sad it was for him to lose his daughter, because he had 3 sons, but here was his only daughter. And this book mentions that she's buried in an English graveyard on Vasily Ostra. Now, Ostra, if you have to know Russian to really appreciate that piece of information, and since I do speak some Russian, Ostra means island, and Vasily means Vasilyevsky Island. So I found out from this strange reference that she was buried in Vasily Ostra. And so with my Russian colleague over in St. Petersburg, Flora Yarmuhamedova, she's my Russian soul sister, we went walking in what we discovered was a Lutheran cemetery in 1996. We decided to go over to Vasilyevsky Island and see if we couldn't find her gravesite. So we wandered through this terribly overgrown graveyard in St. Petersburg, couldn't find her, couldn't find a stone with her name on it or anything. And so for the next, from 1996 until really 2010, I off and on did research trying to figure out why is it we can't find Louisa Catherine Adams's gravesite. And at some point I came across an article in Russian on a terrible flood that was in St. Petersburg in 1824. So she was buried in 1812, and there was this terrible flood in St. Petersburg in 1824, and it mentions that the graves in the Lutheran cemetery were washed away. So I suspect that, or since we couldn't find her gravesite, I suspect that her gravesite and many others were washed away during that, and so that's the reason we couldn't find the grave. But the people in Moscow, through the Russian consulate in American consulate in St. Petersburg, took all this information from St. Petersburg, brought it to Moscow, and through the Moscow embassy and the Daughters of the American Revolution, they decided that this was a project really worth doing something about. And our goal had always been to put a memorial gravestone in that graveyard where she was buried. And so that happened in 2012, September 15th, which was the date, the 200th anniversary of her death in St. Petersburg. So I feel really quite satisfied that one of the chapters in our research that we've been doing on Russian-American ties has kind of been completed. So that is really part of our mission, is to reclaim those lost chapters in Russian-American history that will kind of rebalance maybe the feelings we have between Russians and Americans during the Cold War years, and people like myself who grew up being told that the Russians were the evil empire, and not having that kind of experience really by looking at history, looking backwards in history far enough to see that sometimes periods in history are just blips on 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 the screen, and that if you go further back, you'll see that relationships were quite different, and that's certainly the case with Russia that I found.